Ian Fleming first wrote Casino Royale in 1953, and more than 50 years later, in spite of a 1954 version on CBS and a farcical take in 1967 with a whole slew of people playing James Bond, Daniel Craig got all buff and shiny to play James Bond in perhaps the most faithful adaptation of a Bond novel. This episode might as well be called more like What's Not the Difference? Am I right, Casey?
Not really, friend.
Fine, whatever.
But 2006's Casino Royale is in fact shockingly similar to Ian Fleming's first 007 novel from 1953. I'm Casey Redmond.
I'm Michael Truly.
So without further ado and no restraint on spoilers,
what's the difference?
In 2006, the Bond franchise had suffered through bankruptcy issues and some genuinely awful Pierce Brosnan entries as the film rights bounced between MGM, Sony, and Eon Productions. By the time the light was green for the 21st James Bond film, a complete reboot was clearly the way to go. And what better way to reboot than go back to the very beginning? Casino Royale was indeed the first Bond novel that Ian Fleming wrote. However, Bond was not a brand new 00. He already had a number of missions under his belt.
The movie opens with Bond earning his 00 status by collecting his first two kills. One section chief in his office who was selling MI6 secrets, as well as his contact in a gnarly black and white fistfight in the men's room.
The novel describes Bond's first two kills as a Japanese cipher expert in New York, which very clearly doesn't match up with the movie, and a Norwegian double agent in Stockholm, which might very well be the man depicted in the cold open of the film. I mean, close enough anyway.
Considerably.
The physical description of Bond is also different. Book Bond is described as having dark hair and eyes, a scar down his right cheek, something akin to Hoagie Carmichael, a look that stuck with the actors portraying Bond for decades. Much was made about a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Bond when Daniel Craig was cast, but if I can editorialize a little, seriously, get over it. The brown hairs never did this.
The story of Casino Royale in the book and movie deals with Her Majesty's finest 00 taking down Le Chiffre, a dangerous money man who cooks the books for terrorists. The logistics of the case against Le Chiffre are largely the same in the book and the movie. Le Chiffre loses somebody else's money, and now he's got to win a high-stakes card game to get it back. And Bond is MI6's best card player, and therefore best hope at beating Le Chiffre. In the movie, Bond begins his assignment investigating a bomb maker in Madagascar. After this truly badass parkour chase through a high-rise construction site, he tracks down Alex Dimitrios, a slimy bugger setting up shop in the Bahamas, who in turn leads Bond to suspect Le Chiffre.
In the book, we first meet Bond already on Le Chiffre's tail in the Casino in Royale-les-Jeux, a fictional town on the northern coast of France, as opposed to the movie that takes place in the equally fictional Casino Royale in Montenegro.
Movie Le Chiffre is a mathematical genius and private banker to terrorists around the globe. We first meet him when a mysterious man named Mr. White, on behalf of a mysterious organization, introduces Le Chiffre to an African warlord. Le Chiffre agrees to handle gobs of the warlord's money, but quickly loses it by short-selling stock in Skyfleet, a company that makes fancy aeroplanes. Unfortunately for Movie Le Chiffre, Movie Bond thwarts his plot to blow up Skyfleet's newest and fanciest aeroplane, costing Le Chiffre millions.
Book Le Chiffre is not a banker to the world's terrorist, but instead the official shady money man of Mother Russia. So the money lost by Book Le Chiffre has all come from the Russian espionage infrastructure, specifically SMERSH, a portmanteau of the Russian phrase Smersh Spionom, meaning death to spies, a precursor to Spectre in the chronology of the Bond novels. And as opposed to playing the stock market on fancy airplane stocks, Book Le Chiffre loses Schmerch's money by investing in a line of brothels throughout France, shortly before they pass some get tough on pimping legislation. Though he's a very skilled accountant, Le Chiffre is overweight, sweaty, and pale with a benzodrine inhaler and a strong perverted sexual appetite, hence the heavy investing in houses of ill repute.
Movie Le Chiffre is portrayed nowhere near as vilely. He's a very bad dude, to be sure, and while he's still a sweaty, pale mathematical genius that needs an inhaler, Le Chiffre is really just a cowardly villain who got in over his head and has to dig himself out.
If everybody's ready, let's continue the game.
When we finally get to the card game, in the book, it's Baccarat, a fancy game much more popular in the middle of the century. In the movie, the game is Hold'em Poker, a game booming on ESPN and at every tough guy's basement in 2006. During the game, in both the book and the movie, when Le Chiffre gets worried Bond might actually beat him, an attempt is made on Bond's life. In the movie, Le Chiffre's femme fatale poisons Bond's drink, sending Bond racing to his Aston Martin, where he links up to MI6 intravenously so they can coach him through how to counteract the poison.
In the book, a guy with a gun stands behind Bond until Bond quickly lurches backwards to knock the dude over. It was a cool-looking gun, though. I mean, it had a silencer.
In the book and movie, Bond meets what will become his trusty CIA counterpart, Felix Leiter, or as Jeffrey Wright puts it in the film, your brother from Langley. In the book, Leiter presents himself before Le Chiffre's game and doesn't actually play cards himself. In the movie, Leiter is a player at the poker table and doesn't present himself to Bond until Bond is cleaned out and needs to buy back into the game.
Bond gets cleaned out in the book as well. He wagers big when he thinks he's got Le Chiffre beat, but his hubris gets the best of him and he gets wiped out of the game. But as in the film, good old reliable Felix Leiter stakes in the cash to keep playing.
Should we up the blind?
However, movie Felix only stakes him the money because Vesper Lynd, the representative of Her Majesty's Treasury in the film, doesn't trust Bond's ego to handle forking another $5 million over to a terrorist. A decidedly ballsy stand to take for a woman in a James Bond film.
True, but this one overcompensates by wearing slightly masculine clothing.
The Vesper Lynd character is probably the most glaring and significant difference between the book and the movie. In the midst of dozens of small changes that can be chalked up to cultural changes over the course of 50 years, the difference between the book and the movie Vespers make Bond's 70 cigarettes a day habit seem downright charming. In the movie, Eva Green portrays Lynd as an intelligent, strong-willed, and upwardly mobile employee of the Treasury. She's not impressed with any of Bond's bravado, much less the plan she's helping to facilitate, even reminding Bond upon their first meeting that if he loses, our government will be directly financing terrorism.
In the book, Vesper Lynd is an assistant to the Chief of Section S, more or less a secretary. She's along for the ride to serve as Bond's support, but mostly because it seems prudent for Bond to have a pretty lady on his arm when he walks into the high roller salon at the casino. She's mostly just happy to be here and, ooh, isn't this all very exciting? And Book Bond is straight up pissed that London is sending a bloody woman. He doesn't have time to babysit some doe-eyed bitch playing a man's game and wonders why women can't just stay in the kitchen to fuss over pots and pans and leave a man's work to the men. And that's not an unfair portrayal of the misogyny in which this book is written.
Movie Bond's attitude toward women is less explicitly described. While definitely hanging on to the womanizing ways traditional to James Bond, he only says that he prefers sleeping with married women because it keeps things simple. From his first meeting with Vesper, their verbal sparring is that of equals. She's an immediate challenge to his cocksure super spy act, and he seems to appreciate it.
Every penny of it.
Movie Bond also works for a woman in Casino Royale. The entirety of the Bond franchise, from Connery all the way through Dalton, M, the head of MI6, was portrayed as an older Navy intelligence man, for whom Bond has a fierce respect and loyalty. This casting is taken directly from all of Fleming's novels, but beginning with Pierce Brosnan's run as 007 in GoldenEye, Judi Dench took over the role.
I thought M was a randomly assigned letter. I had no idea it stood for...
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
Daniel Craig's Bond shares his book counterpart's respect for his female boss, but it's unlikely, actually just straight up impossible, to imagine Book 007 would have put up with taking orders from a lady. After Bond is won at cards, the book and the movie become mostly the same for a long stretch. Bond and Vesper have a celebratory dinner until Vesper is called away by a sudden note from Mathis, their local contact. In the book, it's a handwritten note, and in the movie, it's a more modern text.
Mathis needs me.
Vesper is kidnapped by Le Chiffre and Bond gives chase. In the movie, it's an Aston Martin DB5, and in the book, it's a Bentley, until he crashes in spectacular fashion. Book Le Chiffre lays down metal spikes to shred the Bentley, while movie Le Chiffre lays Vesper herself in the middle of the road.
Then Le Chiffre tries to torture Bond to get the location of the winnings. In the movie, it's a password to transfer the funds electronically, and in the book, Bond's just hidden a cashier's check in the hotel really well. And that gnarly ball torture scene from the movie? Straight out of the book, beat for beat. Ball squish for ball squish. The only slight difference is that book Le Chiffre uses a carpet beater, while movie Le Chiffre uses a knotted up length of rope. But when a terrorist is squishing your balls off, it really doesn't matter what he's using to do the squishing, does it?
Yes! Yes! Yes!
The book Ball Torture is interrupted by a man coming to kill Le Chiffre for bungling away Schmersh's money. The Russian assassin has a crag-like face hidden behind a black mask, and after telling Le Chiffre exactly why he's there, the assassin puts a bullet between Le Chiffre's eyes. Bond escapes unkilled, simply because the assassin only received orders to kill the Chiffre, but none to kill Bond. But man, does the crag-faced killer wish he could kill Bond. He settles for carving the Cyrillic letter W into the back of Bond's hand, the symbol of Schmersh, so that when a Schmersh agent comes across Bond in the future, they will know that he's a spy.
The ball torture in the movie is interrupted by a surprise return of Mr. White. He puts the same bullet hole in between the same eyes as his book counterpart, but instead of representing Schmersh, we're left not knowing who the mysterious Mr. White is working for. At least not until the wildly disappointing Quantum of Solace 2 years later.
Book Bond gets his balls patched up in France while Vesper checks in on him every day. It's during his recovery that Bond reflects that he wants to bed Vesper for 2 reasons. 1, because she's good looking and he doesn't particularly hate her. And 2, because he'd like to make sure his junk still works. And so they spend a week at a seaside B&B. It's during the first part of this stay that Bond falls in love with Vesper, for reasons that are mostly unclear.
Again though, much of this can be chalked up to the change in gender politics between 1950s England and 21st century Hollywood scripts.
Then you've learnt your lesson.
No.
Movie Bond convalesces in much the same way, with the exception of having Mathis arrested. Bond thinks that Mathis is a double agent who sold him out to Le Chiffre. Once he's well, instead of a seaside B&B, Bond and Vesper go on a Mediterranean sexcapade, yachting their way to Venice, Italy. The movie does a much better job explaining Bond and Vesper's newfound love. Because of Vesper's strength of character in the movie, she causes Bond to re-examine his decision to become a 00 and lead the cold, detached life of a government assassin. Bond has chosen to love Vesper instead of keeping his license to kill.
Unfortunately for Bond and Vesper, their romance is short-lived. In the book, Bond has made up his mind to marry Vesper until she starts acting more and more melancholy. Then one day, a man in a black eye patch arrives at their hotel. His presence greatly upsets Vesper, and it's ultimately enough for Vesper to commit suicide, overdosing on sleeping pills in her bedroom. In her suicide note, she reveals that she was in fact a double agent. She'd been in love with a Polish man, whom Schmersh captured and were threatening to kill should she not cooperate.
In the movie, Vesper sees a man with a black eye patch as soon as they sail into Venice. Instead of committing suicide and confessing, however, she is revealed to be a double agent when Bond catches her withdrawing the winnings from the poker game and handing it over to Eye Patch Guy. Movie Vesper had also fallen in love with a man who was kidnapped and held hostage by Mr. White's organization. It's also clear, to M anyway, that Vesper had traded the money for Bond's life, explaining why Bond was left alive after the gnarly ball torture. Ultimately, Vesper kills herself in the movie as well, locking herself into an elevator in the wreckage of a building as it crumbles into the Venice canals.
And so, both in the book and the movie, Bond is left betrayed and heartbroken. It's in this moment, however, that we really see Bond become the Bond we all know. He's learned to be cold and unfeeling, to never trust anybody.
In the end of both book and movie, Bond shows his now overdeveloped callousness with one line referring to Vesper and what she represented to 007. "The bitch is dead." But the movie does one better. The first time we hear the James Bond theme song play is at the very end of the film. He's hunted down Mr. White, and as the first strains of the theme fade in, he utters the most famous of all lines that's also a name.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Casino Royale, the novel, was a suspenseful spy tale that set the tone for what we have always found interesting about James Bond, a taste for fine dining, hard drinking, and womanizing. 50 years on, the nuts and bolts of the story are largely the same. Wrap this up, Casey. I've got some drinking and womanizing to do.
That's all for now. I bet you either want to pop in the movie or get around to finally reading the novel or taking a crack at Daniel's Bond sack. Like this video if you want to see more of What's the Difference. Make sure to subscribe to CineFix for more awesome movie content and let us know in the comments what you thought about all the changes. See you next time.